Hello! Hi! How's it going? Just down here in the vaults, were you, by chance, expecting somebody else? Oh boy. Yeah. There you go. Green screens. Well, it's time for a wonderful evening. It is finally time for my big outfit reveal, and also, it happens to be the anniversary of the birthday of Edgar Allan Poe. And among all things, I truly do love a good Cask of Amontillado shitpost. And so I have decided to do a special reading stream for this evening, to do something quite macabre, quite mysterious. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to go get changed, and then we can get into the meat of things. Whoop. Hello! Hello again. Well, it's me, the one and only Cask of Amontillado. Get it? Doe. It's funny because it's doe like a deer. Well, since you're here, down in the vaults, I've decided to, like I said, have a special stream. An evening of the macabre and the mysterious. So I, your hostess with the mostest, would like to do a little reading. So if you'll sit tight, and if you'll just relax, I'd like to start by reading the titular title of tonight's stream, The Cask of Amontillado, originally published in 1846 by Edgar Allan Poe. And then perhaps I'll maybe take some requests, and if not, read some more tales of mystery and suspense before calling it a night. Alright, well, let's get started then. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face. He did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and opportunity, to produce imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack. But in the matter of old wines, he was sincere. In this respect, it did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk one evening, during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with his excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting, party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. but I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts. How, said he. Amontillado, a pipe? Impossible, and in the middle of the carnival? I have my doubts, I replied, and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain. Amontillado? I have my doubts. Amontillado! And I must satisfy them. Amontillado? Are you engaged? I'm on my way to Lucrezi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me... Lucrezi cannot tell Amontillado from Sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go. Whither? To your vaults. My friend, no. I will not oppose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lucrezi. I have no engagements. Come. My friend, no. It is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with night hair. I'm going to mispronounce some words, by the way. Just so you know. Let us go nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado. This guy loves Amontillado. You have been opposed upon, and as for Lucrezi, he cannot distinguish Sherry from Amontillado. Thus speaking, Fortunato possesses himself on my arm, in putting on a mask of black silk, and drawing a roquelaire closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to the plaza. There were no attendants at home. They had absconded to make merry in honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from their sconce 2 flambois, and 1 to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of my home to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together upon the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montesiores. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bell on his cap jingled as he strode. "The pipe," he said. "It's farther on," I said, "but observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned to me and looked into my eyes with 2 flimsy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. "It's here," he asked at length. "It's here," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It's nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision, "we will go back. Your health is precious. You're rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me, it's no matter. We'll go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Lucrezi." "Enough," he said. "The cough's a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough." I can't believe Poe predicted COVID. "True, true," I replied, "and indeed, I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily. But you should use all proper caution. A draught of this Medoc will defend us from the damps." Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle, with which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mold. "Drink," I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly, while his bells jingled. "I drink," he said, "to the buried that repose around us, and I to your long life." He again took my arm, and we proceeded. "These vaults," he said, "are extensive." "The Montesieurs," I replied, "were a great and numerous family." "I forget your arms. A human foot d'or in a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel. In the motto, Nemo mi impune licet." "Good," he said. The wine sparkled in his eyes and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the Medoc. It passed through long walls of piled skeletons, with casks and pochons intermingling. Into the innermost recesses of the catacombs, I paused again, and this time, I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. "The nature," I said. "See, it increases, it hangs like moss upon the walls. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture trickle among the bones. Come, we'll go back, ere it's not too late. Your cough." "It's nothing," he said, "but let us go on. But first, another draught of the Maroc." I broke and reached him a flagon of de Grève. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one. "You do not comprehend," he said. "Not I," I replied. "Then you are not of the Brotherhood?" "No." "You are not of the Masons?" Yes, yes, I said. "Yes, yes." "You? Impossible. A Mason." "A Mason," I replied. "A sign," he said. "A sign." "It is this," I answered, producing from beneath the folds of my Lodaclair a towel. "You jest," he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces, "but let us proceed to the Amontillado." "Be it so," I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily and continued on our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed upon, and descending again, arrived at a deep crypt, in which the foulness of the air caused the flamboirs rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead, in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the 4th side the bone had been thrown down and laid promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the wall that was exposed by the displacing of the bones, we perceived a still interior crypt, or recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, in height 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no special use within itself, but for merely the interval between 2 of the colossal supports on the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of their circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of the recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. "Proceed," I said. "Herein is the Amontillado. As for Lucrezi—" "He is an ignoramus," interrupted my friend, as he stepped unsteadily forward while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood steadily bewildered. A moment more and I had fettered him to the granite. In his surface were 2 iron staples, distanced from each other about 2 feet horizontally. From one of these depend a short chain, from the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it, and he was much too astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. "Pass your hand," I said, "over the wall. I can't help feeling it here. Indeed, it is very damp. Once more let me implore you to return." "No? Then I must positively leave you. But I must first render you all the little attentions in my power." "The Amontillado!" ejaculated my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. "True," I replied. "The Amontillado." As I said these words, I busied myself among the piles of bones with which I had been spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance to the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in a great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had was a low moaning cry from the depths of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was a long and obstinate silence. I laid the 2nd tier and the 3rd and the 4th, and then I heard the furious vibrations of the chains. The noises lasted for several minutes, during which that I might hearken to it with the more satisfaction. I ceased my labors and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking sound subsided, I resumed the trial and finished without interruption the 5th and the 6th and the 7th tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again raised and holding the flamboyant over the masonwork, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated, I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope with it about the recess, for the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I approached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed, I aided. I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamor grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier, and I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position, but now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "Ha ha ha! A very good joke indeed. An excellent jest. We will have many a rich match about the plaza over our wine. The Amontillado, I said. Yes, the Amontillado, but it's not getting late. Will they not be waiting for us at the palazzo? The Lady Fortunato and the rest, let us be gone. Yes, I said. Let us be gone. For the love of God, Monsieur. Yes, I said. For the love of God. But to these words I hearkened in vain. For reply I grew impatient. I called aloud, Fortunato! No answer. I called again, Fortunato! No answer still. I thrust the torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick. It was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so. I hastened to make an end to my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up against the new masonry I'd erected, the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In peace, request. The Cask of Amontillado, originally published by Edgar Allan Poe in 1846. You know, the first time I ever read that story, I had the same response as the classic, if you've ever seen The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror with the Raven, where they come up with the, I guess people were just easier to scare back then, but this one actually gets me a little bit more now. I do love a shitpost. Cask of Amontillado shitposts are definitely one of my favorite genres, kind of hence why I'm doing this. But there's something like, I think as I've gotten older, a little bit more chilling about this, because you don't know anything about Fortunato. He seems like a good dude. A good dude that just has one person who really has it out for him. And that's the end of him. Let's see, I'm gonna recalibrate real quick. Okay, that should work. Yeah. It's a very, I mean, it's an intriguing story to me. It's probably like my favorite Poe work in general. I mean, just the thought of like, hey, there is someone out there, maybe someone you barely know, someone you think that you are on. No, and that's like, they never explain why he hates him. The only thing you get is that the speaker who's narrating all of this says, oh yeah, he insulted me. But when he meets Fortunato, Fortunato is just like, hey, my friend, how you doing? You want to go get this wine? It seems like they're on good terms, but then he gives him, and it's not that he does him in, but he does him in maybe the most frightening way you can imagine. He tricks him down, gets him drunk, tricks him into the catacombs, gets him down there, chains him to a wall, and then seals it with brick. And then 50 years later, it's like, and no one has ever found him. He just disappeared. Fortunato was just gone. It's just like, there's no explanation. It's just, as far as you know, this person just did this because they wanted to. And I find it, I don't know, as I get older, a little bit more chilling. I think there's an old adage that I like. It doesn't really matter, but I find it kind of more enriching to think about it that way, at least in my own reading. There's an old adage that I really like that's, when you're in your teens, you think that you're the protagonist of the story. When you're in your 20s, you realize that everyone is the protagonist of their own story. And when you reach your 30s, you realize you're probably the villain of someone's story. And this hits a little bit here. Fortunato might as well have just been a perfectly fine dude who just happened to say the wrong thing once, and this person decided to give him the most horrific death he possibly could. It's pretty sick. It's a pretty imposing story. I don't know. I like it a lot. So, I do have a drink with me. I feel like I needed to have a drink for the Cask of Amontillado. So I have a nice elderberry mead, which seems appropriately gothic. Ah, thank you for the sub, Ert. Everyone knows it's extremely goth to sub to my channel. Let me switch up a little bit. I'm gonna turn off, let's see, I've got the spooky forest music going. Let's get the spooky house music going. Ah, yes. Wonderful. Well, there are a couple more stories that I've pulled up that I think would be pretty fun to go through. It's giving you Cassandra vibes. Yeah, everyone knows it's extremely goth to sub to me. Well, alright. And thank you all for coming for my extremely goth outfit reveal. I was actually very proud of this work. At least around, as nightmarish as it might be, I think I did a really good job with the eyes. I tried a couple new things, and actually it's a little bit more expressive, I think, even than my usual model. I'm pretty happy. And also I have, like, I can do eyebrow stuff to make it just even more cursed than usual. This was fun. Like, it was a good learning project. I learned a lot about Live 2D doing this, and so we'll see what horrible things I managed to do in the future. I am unbound by mortals. Yeah, it does. It actually does add to the curse that it's more expressive than the default model. All right. Well, how about another reading? A reading that is terribly relevant. The Mask of the Red Death. A short one, but a good one. Also up there. I think when it comes to Poe, the Cask of Amontillado is like a runaway favorite. The Mask of the Red Death is also up there. The Fall of the House of Usher, I think, is probably, like, if I had a top 3 of stories. I had an English professor in college that was a huge Poe nut. And so a lot of that rubbed off on me, hearing a lot of his stories and interpretations and all of that. Alright, let's get appropriately gothic. The Mask of the Red Death. Yeah, absolutely. After this, if you want, I will take requests. I'm going to be here probably for about 2 hours. So if you'd like me to read other poems or anything, just keep it in the Poe world, and I will take requests. That's part of the plan. Alright, The Mask of the Red Death. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar, and its seal the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then a profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. In the whole seizure, progress and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and the dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and macy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair from without or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisores, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there were cards. There was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his thousands of friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7. An imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20th or 30th yards, and each turn a novel effect. To the right and the left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber in which it opened. There at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber's panes were purple, the third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and litten with orange, the fifth was white, the sixth was violet. The 7th apartment was closely enshrouded in black. Velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with its decorations. The panes were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum, amid the profusion of golden adornments that lay scattered to and fro or deepened from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass, and so jarringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances, but in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings throughout the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme. It produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. The pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when its minute hand made the circle of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came forth the brazen lungs of the clock, a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, the musicians in the orchestra were consigned to a pause, momentarily in their performance, to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconnect of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and that the more aged and sedated passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. And when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once prevailed the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock. Then were the same disconcert and tumultuous and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decor of mere fashions. His plans were bold and fiery. His conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. He was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed, in great part, the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers, upon occasion, great fate, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the costumes of the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers was stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. In those, the dreams writhed in and about, taking cue from the rooms and the causing of the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon, there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of velvet, and then, momentarily, all is still, and all is silent save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand. But the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live, and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven there are now none of the maskers who venture. For the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on. Until the length was sounded the 12th hour upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled, and thus again it happened, perhaps, that before the last of the echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure. Which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumors of this presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz, or murmur, expressive at first of disprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, horror, and disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jests can be properly made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor property existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, shrouded from head to toe in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenances of a stiffened corpse, and the closest scrutiny must have been difficult in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved by the mad revelers around, but the murmur had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow with all the features of the face was besprinkled with scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which was a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers. He seemed to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. Prospero's gonna get him. Gonna get him. Someone's crashing his party, masquerading as the Red Death? Nah, not in this house. Not now. Who dares, he demanded hoarsely of the group that stood around him, who dares thus to make mockery of our woes? Uncase the varlet, that we may know whom would have to hang tomorrow at sunrise from the battlements. Will no one stir at my bidding? Stop him and strip him, I say, of those red investitures of sacrilege. We're gonna hang him from the battlements. This person who's come decided to crash this party dressed as a corpse, as we're all hiding in this walled-off castle. It was in the eastern or blue chamber with which stood the Prince Prospero. As he uttered these words, they rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clear, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, but the movement was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the murmur had inspired the whole party, there were found none who would put hand to seize him. So that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls, he made his way into uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step with which had distinguished him from first, through the blue chamber, through the purple, from purple to the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet air. A decided movement had been made to arrest them. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, and while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon them all, he bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached, in rapid impetuosity, to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly round and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the murmurer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in utter horror at the finding the grave cremence and corpse-like mask, which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bewildered halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the light of the ebony clock went out, and with that the last of the gay. And the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held limitable dominion over all. The Mask of the Red Death. Edgar Allan Poe, published 1842. Yeah, like, unfortunately, the Red Death finally came for the gays. And that's how... And another good... It's topical, right? You have the wealthy prince, he's like, well, you know, this plague is ravaging the countryside. I'm just gonna pack up and, like, get 1,000 of my friends, and we're just gonna, like, go and have, like, a really cool party until this rolls over, and, like, it's gonna be fine, right? So they throw this non-stop rager, wall themselves up so no one can come in and no one can go out. And the thought is that, in doing so, we're all gonna be safe. There's no way that the Red Death can possibly come here. And then while they're having this banger of a party, everyone's a little bit uneasy. This clock strikes every hour, and everyone's like, "Oh, well, that's creepy." And then finally, people start seeing this character moving around dressed like a corpse in the party, and just absolutely killing the vibe. So Prospero is like, "Oh, come on, dude! Someone grab that guy and throw him out." Yeah, the entire place, and like, of course, the lighting and everything. The entire place is dyed red by the light. It's all ominous, and then there's this figure. It appears. Prospero's like, "Get that dude! He is harshing the vibe." And well, in doing so, he dies quickly. Dies of the Red Death. Presumably, everyone else is going to die of it. They've locked themselves in. It's a lot of entombing and a lot of Poe's work. It's interesting, but it's another good one. I think it's pretty relevant. I think now, just living through a pandemic, to be like, oh wow, these people that think that they can wall themselves up and be protected by security and wealth and fortune, and maybe not. The Red Death does come for us all. All right. Well, that was The Mask of the Red Death. Having been following the Cask of Amontillado. Take another sippy of my mead. Anything else? I have a couple more that I can read, but I know there were some requests there. If you'd really like, I could even make it into an ASMR stream. Oh, the lake. That's a good one. Let me bring it up. All right. I'm not gonna shitpost too hard and try to make it ASMR, but I do have the two microphones. If you're listening in headphones, you should be getting binaural audio. Anyway, the lake. Edgar Allan Poe. In spring of youth, it was my lot to haunt of the wide earth a spot, to which I could not love the less, so lovely was the loneliness of a wild lake with a black rock bound and the tall pines that towered around. But when the night had thrown her pall upon the spot as upon all, and the mythic wind went by, murmuring in melody, then, ah then I would awake to the terror of the lone lake. Yet the terror was not fright, but a tremulous delight, a feeling not the jeweled mine could teach or bribe me to define, nor love, although the love were thine. Death was in that poisonous wave, and in its gulf a fitting grave, for him who thence could solace bring to his lone imagining, whose solitary soul could make an Eden of that dim lake. You know, Poe's poetry is excellent. It's stuff that I think as a kid, I always was under the impression that, like, you know, I grew up in the 90s, so I grew up in the slasher boom of the 90s, and I had a very set idea of what horror is supposed to be. And gothic horror and a lot of Poe's work was just never quite really clicked with me. It was just like, I guess I expected it to be scarier, and it never got that reaction from me. And so it took me a long time, and then I finally got it. And then I think I finally come to it, like, an age and experience come to appreciate where some of this comes to. Exactly. Like, you kind of need to know, like, it fades 100%. 100%. Yeah, it's unnerving, and it gets more unnerving because a lot of it's about the tenuousness of life in loss, and I think you need to have had life shit on you a bit. And you need to realize how close you are to disaster in order to really get what Poe's going for. Like, again, I was a white kid in the suburbs in 10th grade. Exactly. Like, life had not shit on me enough. And when you know his life had shit on Poe a lot. Like, a lot. So once you've come to that point and you realize, like, wow, I'm one or two bad decisions away from disaster and poverty, I think it starts to hit a little bit different. And you realize that you're not invincible. Like, that's why the Cask of Amontillado hits for me now when it didn't in 10th grade. Because before I was like, this is just a goofy story. But it's like, no, what if there was someone out there who just hates your guts and wants to, and you don't know what you did. Maybe you didn't do anything, but they just can't stand you and they want to hurt you. Like, that's frightening to me now. Which when it wasn't before, it's unnerving. It makes it like, even the people that you think you're on good terms with might have ill intentions for you, and you have no way of knowing that. Kinda, it's much more, and even in the Mask of the Red Death is about how there are certain things that you can't be protected from. No amount of wealth, no amount of security is going to protect you from things like disease and time. A 10-year-old in the suburbs just didn't quite understand that, and now as a not 10-year-old in the not suburbs, it makes a little bit more sense. Alright. Any more requests at all? Angel of the Odd. Alright, let me bring it up. Do love that everything is also... basically everything is public domain for him as well. so I can just read things. The Angel of the Odd by Edgar Allan Poe. Published 1844. Let's get a little shift in that Dova syndrome here. You know, unfortunately, the dear but it's fucked up, I think, is a more modern horror convention. And that seems like more of an intro. I think I'm just gonna keep going with this one. Yeah, dear but fucked up is definitely for some reason a trend in current horror, especially with movies like Antlers. What was it? The Ritual, Antlers, like there's a bunch of like Wendigo and like dear but fucked up horror films for some reason. Not that I'm complaining. I've never been more popular than now. Alright. Get a good stretch. This is gonna be a long one. It was a chilly November afternoon. I had just consummated an unusually hearty dinner, in which the dysepic truffle formed not the least important item, and I was sitting alone in the dining room, with my feet upon the fender, and at my elbow a small table with which I had rolled up to the fire, and upon which were some apologies for dessert, with some miscellaneous bottles of wine, spirit, and liqueur. In the morning I had been reading Glover's Leonidas, Wilkes's Epigonagad, Lamartine's Pilgrimage, Barlow's Cumberlad, Tuckerman's Sicily, and Griswold's Curiosities. I am willing to confess, therefore, that I now felt a little stupid. I made an effort to arouse myself by aid of frequent latif, and all falling, I betook myself to a stray newspaper in despair. Having carefully perused the column of houses to let and the column of dogs lost, and then the 2 columns of wives and apprentices run away, I attacked with great resolution the editorial matter, and, reading it from beginning to end without understanding a syllable, conceived the possibility of its being... I forgot about this one. Of its being Chinese, and so reread it from the end to the beginning with no more satisfactory result. I was about throwing away in disgust. Yeah, so basically this guy's like, just pretentious as shit. This folio of 4 pages happy work, which not even critics criticize, when I felt my attention somewhat aroused by the paragraph which follows. The avenues to death are numerous and strange. A London newspaper mentions the decease of a person from a singular cause. He was playing at Puff the Dart, which is playing with a long needle inserted in some worsted and blown at a target through a tin tube. He placed the needle at the wrong end of the tube and, drawing his breath strongly to puff the dart forward with force, drew the needle into his throat. It entered his lungs, and in a few days killed him. Upon seeing this, I fell into a great rage without exactly knowing why. This thing I example, it's a contemptible falsehood, a poor hoax, the lees of the intervention of some pitiable penny a liner, of some watch contractor of accidents in Kogan. These fellows, knowing the extravagant gullibility of the age, set their wits to work in the imagination of improbable possibilities, of odd accidents, as they term for them, but to a reflecting intellect like mine. Like, added in parentheses, putting my finger unconsciously at the side of my nose. Poe predicted air quotes back in 1844. To a contemplative understanding such as myself possess, it seems evident at once that the marvelous increase of late in these odd accidents is by far the oddest accident of all. For my own part, I intend to believe henceforth that it has anything of the singular about it. Mein Gott! Then what wohl? Yours best for that, I replied, some of the most remarkable voices I had heard. He's even, oh my god, this motherfucker is Chuni! Just throwing German in? Yeah, real cool. Mein Gott! Then what fool? You best for that. That's not even German. I replied to one of the most remarkable voices I had heard. At first, I took it for a rumbling in my ears, such as a man sometimes experiences when getting very drunk. But upon second thought, I concerned the sound as more nearly resembling that which proceeds from an empty barrel beaten with a big stick, and in fact, this I should have concluded it to be, but for the articulation of the syllables and words. I am by no means naturally nervous, and the very few glasses of Lafette which I had sipped served to embolden me no little, so that I felt nothing of trepidation, but merely uplifted my eyes with a leisurely movement and looked carefully around the room for the intruder. I could not, however, perceive any one at all. I resumed the voice as I continued my survey. You must pee so donk as the pig, then for not see me, it sit here as your side. Hereupon, I bethought me of looking immediately before my nose, and there, sure enough, confronting me at the table, sat a personage nondescript, although not altogether indescribable. His body was a wine pipe, or a rumpishon, or something of that character, and had a trusty Phosphalian air. In its nether extremity were inserted 2 kegs, which seemed to answer all the purposes of legs. Yeah, it definitely sounds like an under night move list. For arms, there dangled from the upper portion of the carcass 2 tolerably long bottles, for the necks outward for hands. All the head that I saw the monster possess was that of the Hessian canteens, which resembled a large snuff box with a hole in the middle of the lid. This canteen, with a funnel in its top, like a caviar cap slouched over for eyes, was set upon the edge of the puncheon, with the hole towards myself. And through this hole, which seemed puckered up like the mouth of a very precise old maid, the creature was emitting certain rumbling and grumbling noises, which he evidently intended for intelligible talk. "I say," he said, "you must be drunk as the pig. So zit za du zim zit is there. I say du must be the pig. For the goose, what it is belief is that a print is a print. 'Tis the truth that is it, is where verb of it." "Who are you, pray?" I said with much dignity, although somewhat puzzled. "How did you get in here? And what is it you're talking about?" "If I were to come in," replied the figure, "that is none of your business. And as for what you've been talking about, I be talk about what I think proper, and as for who I be for that is the very thing I come here for to tell you that yourself." "You are a drunken vagabond," said I, "and I shall ring the bell and order my footmen to kick you out into the street." He, said the fellow. Who, that you can't do." "Can't do," I said. "What do you mean I can't do? What?" "Ringing the bell," he replied, attempting a grin with his villainous mouth. Upon this I made an effort to get up in order to put my threat into execution, but the ruffian just reached across the table very deliberately and hitting me a tap on the forehead with the neck of one of the long bottles, knocked me back into the armchair with which I had half arisen. I was utterly astounded. For a moment was quite at a loss for what to do. In the meantime, he continued his talk. "You see," he said, "is this the best for thee still, and now you shall know who I be. Look at me, I am the angel of the odd." "And odd enough too," I ventured to reply, "but I was always under the impression that an angel had wings." "The wing," he cried, heavily incensed. "But I beat him at the wing. Mein Gott, do you take me for the chicken?" This is wonderful. I love that Poe managed to hit my favorite trope, which is people putting random German words in here. "Do you take me for a chicken?" is, I mean, obviously an amalgamation of German and English. Should be like, "Do you take me for a chicken?" Oh, no, I replied much alarmed. "You are no chicken, certainly not." "Well, then sit still, for have yourself, and I'll wrap you again mid-vivest. It is the chicken at the wing, und the owl at the wing, und the timp in the wing, und the truffle up the wing. The angel have not the wing, and I am the angel of the odd." "And what is your business with me at present?" "It is my business," ejaculated the thing. "Wie wird a low-bred puppy must be to a gentleman and an angel about his business." This language was rather more than I could bear, even from an angel, so I pluckered up courage. I seized a salt cellar with lay within reach and hurled it at the head of the intruder. Either he dodged, however, or my aim was inaccurate, for all I accomplished was the demolition of the crystal which protected the dial of the clock upon the mantelpiece. As for the angel, he evidenced his sense of my assault by giving me 2 or 3 hard consecutive raps upon the forehead as before. These reduced me at once to submission, and I am almost ashamed to confess that either through the pain or vexation, there came a few tears to my eyes. "Mein Gott," said the angel of the odd, apparently much softened at my distress. "Mein Gott, a man is either very drunk or very sorry. You must not drink it so strong. You mustn't wear the wine. Here, drink this, like a good fellow, und a grey now don't." Upon the angel of the odd replenished my goblet, which was about a third full of port, with a colorless fluid that he poured from one of his hand bottles. I observed that these bottles had labels about their necks and that these labels were inscribed Kinchenwasser, Kirchenwasser, oh my gosh. This is really funny to me, actually. It's absolutely like 100% in the... Was Edgar Allan Poe a weeb? Just throwing in random German words. I love this. The considerate kindness of the angel mollified me in no little measure, and aided by the water with which he diluted my port more than once, I at length regained sufficient temper to listen to his very extraordinary discourse. I cannot pretend to recount all that he told me, but I gleaned from what he said that he was the genius who presided over the contretemps of mankind, whose business it was to bring about the odd accidents which are continually astonishing the skeptic. Once or twice upon my venturing to express my total incredulity in respect to his pretensions, he grew very angry, indeed, so that at length I considered it the wiser policy to say nothing at all, and let him have his own way. He talked on, therefore, at great length, while I merely leaned back in my chair with my eyes shut, and amused myself with the munching raisins and filliping the stems about the room. But by and by, the angel suddenly construed his behavior of mine into contempt. He arose in a terrible passion, slouched his funnel down over his eyes, and swore a vast oath, uttered a threat of some character which I did not precisely comprehend, and finally made me a low bow and departed, wishing me in the language of the archbishops in Gilbas, "Le coupe du bonheur est une pure plus de bon sens." His departure afforded me relief. The very few glasses of tea that I had sipped had the effect of rendering me drowsy, and I felt inclined to take a nap of some 15 or 20 minutes, as is my custom after dinner. At 6 I had an appointment of consequence, which I was quite indispensable that I should keep. The policy of insurance for my dwelling had expired the day before, and some dispute had arisen. It was agreed that at 6 I should meet the board of directors of the company and settle the terms of a renewal. Glancing upon the clock on the mantelpiece, for I felt too drowsy to take out my watch, I had the pleasure to find that I had still 25 minutes to spare. It was 5:30. I could easily walk to the insurance office in 5 minutes. And my usual siestas had never been known to exceed 5:20. I felt sufficiently safe, therefore, and composed myself to my slumbers forthwith. Having completed them to my satisfaction, I again looked toward the timepiece and was half inclined to believe that the possibility of odd ancients when I found that, instead of my ordinary 15 to 20 minutes, I had been dozing only 3. For it still wanted 7:20 of the appointed hour. I bespoke upon myself again to nap, and at length the second time awoke, when, to my utter amazement, I still wanted 27 minutes of 6. I jumped to examine the clock and found that it had ceased running. My watch informed me that it was 7:30, and of course, having slept 2 hours, I was late for my appointment. "It will make no difference," I said. "I can call the office in the morning and apologize. In the meantime, what can be the matter with the clock?" Upon examining it, I realized that one of the raisin stems which I had been flipping around the room during the discourse of the angel at Bod had flown through the fractured crystal and lodging singularly enough in the keyhole with an open end projecting outward, thus arresting the revolution of the minute hand. "Ah," I said, "I see how it is. This thing speaks for itself, a natural accident, such as will happen now and then." I gave the matter no further consideration, and at my usual hour retired to bed. Here, having placed a candle upon a reading stand at the bed head, and having made an attempt to peruse some pages of the omnipresence of the deity, I unfortunately fell asleep in less than 20 seconds, leaving the light burning Leaving the light burning as it was. Something bad is going to happen. My dreams were terrifically disturbed by visions of the angel of the odd. Methought he stood at the foot of the couch, drew aside the curtains, and in the hollow disfigurable tone of the Rompachon, menaced me with the bitterness vengeance of the contempt with which I had treated him. He concluded a long harangue by taking off his funnel cap, inserting the tube into my gullet, and thus deluging me with an ocean of Kirschenwasser, which he poured in a continuous flood from one of the long-necked bottles that stood instead of an arm. My agony was at length insufferable, and I awoke just in time to perceive that a rat had run off with a lighted candle from the stand, but not in season to prevent him from making his escape with it through the hole. Very soon, a strong, suffocating odor assailed my nostrils. The house, I clearly perceived, was on fire. In a few minutes, the blaze broke forth with violence, and in an incredibly brief period, the entire building was wrapped in flames. All egress from my chamber, except through a window, was cut off. The crowd, however, quickly procured and raised a long ladder. By means of this, I was descending rapidly and in apparent safety when a huge hog, about whose rotund stomach, and indeed those whose whole air, Physiognomy, there was something which reminded me of the Angel of the Odd. When this hog, I say, which hitherto had been quietly slumbering in the mud, took it suddenly into his head that his left shoulder needed scratching, and could find no more convenient rubbing post than that afforded by the foot of the ladder, in an instant I was precipitated and had the misfortune to fracture my arm. All right, so let's rewind this. Basically, he's visited by the Angel of the Odd after he sits there and says he's reading basically a gossip column that's kind of recounting weird stories and odd happenstances, and he says, "This is garbage. This doesn't really happen. This is all made up." And so he's visited by the very German Angel of the Odd, who says, "I am the Angel of the Odd. I am the one that makes these things happen, and it is made of a keg and wine bottles." And so, from that point on, he is only having odd accidents. First, he oversleeps his appointment because he flicked the stem of like a grape, and it just perfectly landed to stop his clock. Then he sits down, oversleeps, and then it's like, it's fine. I'll go ahead. I'll just like do it, whatever. And then what happens? But he sits down, falls asleep too early with a lit candle. A rat knocks it over and sets his whole building on fire. As he's trying to escape the building on this ladder, a large hog comes over and just knocks over the ladder. Look, I'm on the Team Angel right now. Like, I'm on the team of the Angel of the Odd. Yeah, I carelessly threw a grape stem and it ruined my life. Alright, so he's fractured his arm. This is honestly a very funny story. This accident, with the loss of my insurance and with the more serious loss of my hair, the whole of which had been singed off by the fire, predisposed me to serious impression, so that I finally made up my mind to take a wife. There was a rich widow disconsolate for the loss of her 7th husband, and to her wounded spirit I offered the balm of my vows. She yielded a reluctant consent to my prayers. I knelt at her feet in gratitude and adoration. She blushed and bowed her luxuriant tresses into close contact with those supplied me, temporarily by Grangine. I know not how the entanglement took place, and so it was. I arose with a shining pate, wigless, she in disdain and wraith, half buried in alien hair. Thus ended my hopes of the widow by an accident with which could not have been anticipated. To be sure, by which the natural sequence of events had brought about. So now his hair is burned off, he tries to take a wife, and she gets freaked out by his wig. Without despairing, however, I undertook the siege of a less implacable heart. The fates were again propitious for a brief moment, but again a trivial incident interfered. Meeting my betrothed in an avenue thronged with the elite of the city, I was hastened to greet her with one of the best considerate bows, when a particle of some foreign matter lodging in the corner of my eye rendered me, for the moment, completely blind. Before I could recover my sight, the lady of my love had disappeared, irreparably affronted at what she chose to consider my premeditated rudeness in passing her by ungreeted. While I stood bewildered at the suddenness of this accident, which might have happened nevertheless to anyone under the sun, and while I still continued incapable of sight, I was accosted by the Angel of the Odd, who preferred me with his aid with a civility which I had no reason to expect. He examined my disordered eye with much gentleness and skill, informed me that I had a drop in it, and whatever a drop was, took it out, and afforded me relief. See? The Angel of the Odd, A+. Solid, like, just good intentions all around. I now considered it high time to die, since fortune had so determined to persecute me, and accordingly made my way to the nearest river. Here, divesting myself of my clothes, for there was no reason why we cannot die as we were born, I threw myself headlong into the current, the sole witness of my fate being a solitary crow that had been seduced into the eating of a brandy-saturated corn, and so had staggered away from his fellows. No sooner had I entered the water than this bird took it into his head to fly away with the most indispensable portion of my apparel. Postponing, therefore, for the present, my suicidal design, I just slipped my nether extremities into the sleeves of my coat and bestook upon myself the pursuit of the felon with all the nimbleness which the case required and its circumstances would admit. But the evil destiny attended me still, as I ran at full speed with my nose up in the atmosphere. I intended only upon the pioneer of my property. I suddenly perceived that my feet rested no longer upon terra firma. The fact is, I had thrown myself over a precipice. and should inevitably have been dashed to pieces but for my good fortune in grasping the end of a long guided rope which depended from a passing balloon. Literally cannot die, and then Wile E. Coyoteing himself off a cliff. As soon as I sufficiently recovered my senses to comprehend the terrific predicament in which I stood or rather hung, I exerted all the power of my lungs to make that predicament known to the aeronaut overhead. But for a long time I exerted myself in vain. Either the fool could not, nor the villain could not perceive me. Meanwhile, the machine rapidly soared, while my strength even more rapidly failed. I was soon upon the point of resigning myself to fate and dropping quietly into the sea when my spirits were suddenly revived by hearing a hollow voice from above, which seemed to be lazily humming an opera air. I looked up. I perceived the Angel of the Odd. He was leaning with his arm folded over the rim of the car and with a pipe in his mouth at which he puffed leisurely. He seemed to be upon excellent terms with himself and the universe. I was much too exhausted to speak, so I merely regarded him with an imploring air. For several minutes, although he looked me full in the face, he said nothing. At length, removing carefully his masham from the right of the left corner of his mouth, he condescended to speak. Who pee you, he said. Un what de truffle un père de do? Like, un père du dare. To this piece of impudence, cruelty, and affection, I could only reply, only with ejaculating the monosyllable, help. Help! Echoed the ruffian. Not I. There c'est portel, et pour yourself un déchant. With these words, he let fall a heavy bottle of Kirschenwasser, which, dropping precisely upon the crown of my head, caused me to imagine that my brains were entirely knocked out. Impressed with his idea, I was about to relinquish my hold and give up the ghost with good grace, when I was arrested by the cry of the angel who bade me on. Hold on, he said. Don't be in a hurry. Don't. We'll be to order a bottle when you have a zoba yet and come to your senses. I made haste upon to nod my head twice, once in the negative, meaning there I would prefer taking another bottle at present, and once in the affirmative, intending thus to imply that I was sober, and had positively come to my senses. By these, I somewhat softened the angel. Und die Brieften, he said. At last, you Brieften into possibility of to odd. I again nodded, my head in assent. When you have belief in me, the angel of the odd. I nodded again. When you acknowledge that you had put into blind into fool. I nodded once more. Put your right hand into your left hand, preacher's pocket ten, and take it over the Zul Zubzimzian und the angel of the odd. Basically saying, submit yourself to me, the angel of the odd. Now you acknowledge that all these weird things are happening and you know that I'm real. You sit there talking shit, thinking you were nice, and then this is what happened to you. You are now living you are literally in a Hanna-Barbera cartoon. This thing, for very obvious reason, I found quite impossible to do. In the first place, my left arm had been broken in the fall from the ladder, and therefore I had to let go of let go of my hold with the right hand, I must have let go altogether. In the second place, I could have no breeches until I came across the crow. I was therefore obliged, much to my regret, to shake my head in the negative, intending thus to give the angel to understand that I found it inconvenient, just at that moment, to comply with his very reasonable demand. No sooner, however, had I ceased shaking my head than, "Go to the truffle, then," roared the angel of the odd. And pronouncing these words, he drew a sharp knife across the guide rope by which I was suspended, and as we happened to precisely over my own house, which during my migrations had been handsomely rebuilt, it occurred that I tumbled headlong into the ample chimney and lit upon the dining room hearth. Upon coming to my senses, for the fall had very thoroughly stunned me, I found it was about 4 o'clock in the morning. I lay outstretched where I had fallen from the balloon. My head groveled into the ashes of an extinguished fire, while my head reposed upon the wreck of a small tube, overthrown amidst the fragments of a miscellaneous dessert. Intermingled with a newspaper, some broken glass, and a shattered bottle, and an empty jug of the Shadam Kirschenwasser. Thus revenged himself, the angel of the odd. Was it a dream? That's spooky! I don't know, I feel like this is a very fun one.
And people say Germans aren't funny.
That's a good redeem. That's a strong redeem. Yeah. Nice timing on that one. Yeah, it's like... he created his whole balloon hoax. That's wonderful. Oh my gosh. Like, it's just, he's like, he's reading the story, and then of course he wakes up, and then he's next to a bottle, like an empty jug of Kirschenwasser, which is a cherry. It's basically it's cherry brandy.
That makes sense.
So he's sitting there drunk off his ass. Like you could argue, like probably interpret he hallucinates this whole elaborate piece where he's basically living the life of Wile E. Coyote, while this angel of the odd, who is a barrel with wine bottles for limbs and a cigar box for a head, is speaking to him in broken German. It keeps telling him like, "Oh, you think you're nice? You think that all these weird stories that you read about aren't real? I'm the angel of the odd. I make them happen. You should believe in me, and I'm going to punish you until you do." I mean, of all things, of all the ways that you could be smote by an angel, the angel of the odd just playing pranks on you seems like a decent way to go. Alright, let me... The angel of the odd. The angel of the odd absolutely could pass for a cursed VTuber. Yeah, it's like getting smoked by angel, like just being killed by a series of weird coincidences. Like, come on. All right, I think what I'm going to do here. So here's my plan. I'm going to read the Black Cat at Raina's request, unless anyone else has a request at all, and then I'll probably end with the Raven. I feel like I kind of have to do that. That feels like an obligation. And then we will call this a successful first installment in the Cask of Amontillado reading series, an evening of mystery and macabre. How does that sound? I'm very pleased with myself, if you can't tell. When do we get to Kafka? Oh. Don't go spoiling my next outfit. What's your favorite Kafka story? Is it? I'm assuming it's not Metamorphosis. Yeah, the next outfit is going, "Oh, you spoiled it. It was going to be a giant cockroach." Look, some people get these outfit reveals and they're like, it's fabulous, it's fashionable, it's wonderful. Thousands of fan artists are making pieces about it because it's just such an inspiring design. And me, I'm a barrel. I'm a cask. The Cask of Amontillado. Alright. The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe, published 1845. I am indeed occasionally a Fumo too. I guess I have 3 outfits now. How about that? And a 4th in the works, but that's an extremely cursed secret project that will be hopefully never shown to the public. Some things just shouldn't be. Even I have limits. Yes, the Malort tuber. There's Fumo, and then Fumo with a gun, and then Malort tuber. I think that's the hierarchy of my power. Alright. Take a sip of this wonderful elderberry mead. The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. For the most wild yet most homely narrative with which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it in any case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not. Sorry, I got to check it there for a second. Unfortunately, it is I am unsponsored. I am unsponsored BTW. But if Jepsons if Jepsons themselves would like to sponsor my content, I would be open to it. Anyway. But very surely I do not drink. Yet mad I am not, and very surely I do not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet, I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many, they will seem less terrible than Baroque's. However, perhaps some intellect may be found with which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe Nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. Yeah. I love, it's very fun to go through and try to re-paraphrase some of these, because basically this is like, that is kind of the interpretation here. It's like, look, I know this is gonna sound weird, but you gotta believe me. From my infancy, I was noted for the docility and humility of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With those I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal pleasures. To those who have cherished an affection of a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart, who has frequently occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of a mere man. Basically, our writer here is a dog guy, and I understand this. To have cherished the affection of a good dog is truly wonderful. Yeah, thank you for calling that. I married early and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astonishing degree. And speaking of intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mentioned to the matter at all for no better reason than it behaves just so now to be remembered. Pluto was the cat's name. Was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me whenever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of fiend and temperance, had I blushed to confess, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length I even offered her personal violence. Oh gosh. He's just like admitting, like, I basically became a raging and abusive person. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still remained sufficient. Regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, and even the dog, when by accident or through affection, they came in my way. But as my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol? And at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. So our speaker, our writer, is a violent alcoholic. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him when in his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more fiendish, malevolent, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fiber of my frame. I took from the waistcoat a pocket knife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately— oh my god. This is kind of horrifying. Deliberately cut one of his eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept on the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentimental half-horror, half-remorse for the crime with which I had been guilty, and at best, a feeble and equivocal feeling. And the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, I hope this guy gets bodied by this cat. I'm on Team Pluto. I want the Angel of the Odd and Pluto to team up and body this guy with comical cat-related coincidences. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented in true a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left, as to be first grieved by his evident dislike on my part of the creature which had once loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, in my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perversiveness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account, yet I am not more sure that my soul lives, that I am perverse in one of the more primitive impulses of the human heart. It's one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man, who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or silly action, for no other reason than because he knows he should not. Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? The spirit of perversiveness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the sake of wrong only, that urged me to continue and finally consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with the tears streaming in my eyes and with the bitterness and remorse at my heart. I hung it because I knew that it had loved me, because I felt that I had been giving no reason offense. Hung it because I knew that in doing so I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the infinite reach of the mercy of the most merciful and terrible God. On the night of the day with which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from the sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains on my bed were in flames. The whole house was blazing. It was great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself henceforth to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts and wish to leave here even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeded in the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. The exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood in the middle of the house and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering here had in great measure resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion with a very minute and eager attention, with the words strange, singular, and other similar expressions. Excited my curiosity, I approached and saw that it gave a bas relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope around the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, I could scarcely regard it as less. My wonder and my terror were extreme, but at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in the garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by some of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had been probably done with the view of arousing me from sleep, thus falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which the flames and the ammonia from the carcass had then accomplished the portraiture I saw. Although I thus readily accounted for my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact that it did not less fail to make me a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period it came back to my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. Though insofar as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species and of somewhat similar appearance with which to supply its place. So, after murdering this cat, and then having the house burned down with the strange and mysterious image of a cat burned into the one surviving piece of wall, what does he do? He goes and gets another cat. One night, as I sat half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogshires of gin or of rum, which constituted the chief forfeiture of the apartment. Had I looked so steadily upon the top of his hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me to surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite, splotch of white covering a large region of its breast. Upon touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase of the landlord, and this person had made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, and had never seen it before. I continued my caress, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stopping and patting as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. My god, woman, just please leave this guy. For my part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for me rather disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature. A certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty prevented me from physically abusing it. I did not for some weeks strike or otherwise violently ill-use it. But gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unmutterable loathing and flee silently to its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added to no doubt to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning I brought it home. Like Pluto, it had been deprived of one of its eyes. The circumstances, however, only endeared it to my wife, who had, as I had already said, possessed in a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasure. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with pertinacity, which it would not be difficult to make the reader comprehend. When I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caress. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or fastening its long, sharp claws in my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast, and at such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from doing so, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. So, he's very afraid of this cat now. Good. I hope the cat kills him. The dread was unexpectedly a physical... the dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet it should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. He's terrified of this cat, even more so than a mythical beast. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of the white hair of which I have spoken, and which constitutes the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and for which then my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a rigorous distinctiveness outline. It was now the representation of an object I shuddered to name, and for this all above I loathed and dreaded, and would have ridden myself with the monster had I dared. It was now I say the image of a ghastly thing, of the gallows, a mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and death. And now I was indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me a man fashioned in the image of the high God. So much of insufferable woe, alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment to atone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased the hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abide myself, my unaccompanied wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. So, the one thing, he is worse. He has only gotten worse and is even more abusive now, in fear of this cat and guilt. One day she accompanied me upon some household errands into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep steps and nearly throwing me headlong exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting my wrath, the childish dread which I had stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal which of course would have proven instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe into her brain. She fell down upon the spot without a groan. Alright. We've graduated from killing the cat for no other reason than that you know that it's shitty, to now having killed your wife. Dude sucks. The hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith and with entire deliberation to the task of concealing the body. I knew I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. When my projects entered my mind, at one point, I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire, and another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it in the well within the yard, about packing it in a box as if merchandise and using the usual arrangements to getting so porter to take it from the house. Finally, it hit upon me that I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. Oh yeah, it all comes back to walling up victims in the cellar. Can't imagine doing that. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and it had been plastered throughout with a rough plaster which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, if one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar, I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall up the whole of as before, until that no eye could detect anything suspicious. In this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar, I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully disposed of the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while with little trouble I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I carefully went over to the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at last, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at that moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed by the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the deep and blissful sense of relief when the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus for one night at least, since its induction to the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man. The monster, in terror, had fled the premises forever. I should not behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few queries had been made, but they had been readily answered. Even a search for had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came very unexpectedly into the house and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premise. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatsoever. When the officers bade me accompany in their search, they left no nook or cranny unexplored. At length, for the third and fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one that slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arm upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied, and I prepared to depart. The glee of my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say but one word by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure the assurance of my guilt. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to allay your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more curiosity. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house." In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I muttered at all. I say, what an excellently well-constructed house. The walls, are you going to, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together, and here, through my mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which held in my hand upon the very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of my wife, of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the archfiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry at first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous, anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing, a shriek, a half horror, a half triumph, such as might have arisen out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, of the demons that exult in damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity in terror and awe, and the next a dozen stout arms were trolling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head with red extended mouth and solitary eyes of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me to murder, whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. The Black Cat, Edgar Allan Poe, 1845. So he kills the cat, is ruined by the cat, and then ultimately outed by the cat. You know what? We love it. We love to see the cat. Basically, it's the telltale cat. The telltale cat, the cask of the telltale cat, and yeah, something like that. And these stories are fun. Poe's writing is so good. There's actually like, in a lot of it, there's an element of humor, and if not direct humor, just irony. It's just very fun. Like, all of his work is just it's charming. It gets you feel tension, but then there's levity. It's such good writing. It's so much fun to sit down and just kind of talk about it and share it with people. All right. Okay. So this is going to be the last story. I feel like this one's very appropriate. Maybe the most appropriate way to end the stream. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, published 1845. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over a many quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak of December, and at each separate dying ember thought its woes a ghost upon my floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books her case of sorrow, sorrow for my lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whose the angels named Lenore, nameless here for it nevermore. And the silken sad rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me filled with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating an entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, that is it and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," I said, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact that I was napping, so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door, darkness there and nothing more. Deep in that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams that no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence wasn't broken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word that wasn't spoken was the whispered word Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word Lenore, merely this, and nothing more. Back in the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon after I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," I said, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see wherein that is. This a mystery to explore. Let my heart, may still be the moment, but this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more." Open here I fling the shutter, when with many flirt and flutter, in there steeped in stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obedience made he, not a minute stopped and stayed he, but with my lord and lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this emerly bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me why thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marvel this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living being ever yet was blessed with seeing a bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculpted bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven sitting lonely, placid bust spoke only that one word, as if his soul is that one he did outpour. Nothing further than he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, of friends I have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then said the bird, nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it mutters, it's only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and following faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope the melancholy burden bore of the never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I took myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking that this ominous bird of yore, with this grim ungavely gantly gaunt and ominous bird of yore, meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining, on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamp light goaded glore, and whose velvet lining with lamp light gloated o'er, she shall press on nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tickled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by angels hath besent thee, respite in Nepothine, from thee memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind Nepothine, and forgot this lost Lenore, quoth the raven, nothing more. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, still of bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by the God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the desert Aden, and it shall clasp a saintly maiden, with whom the angels named Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels named Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign in parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked of starting, to get thee into the tempest, and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as token, and that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave thy loneliness unbroken, quite they bust above my door. Take thy break from out our heart, and take thy form from off my door, quoth the raven, nothing more. And then the raven, never flirting, still sitting, on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes still have the seeming of a demon that is dreaming, and the lampered o'er streaming his shadowy floor, and my soul from the shadow that lies on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. The Raven, Edgar Allan Poe, 1949. Well, this seems like a pretty worthwhile time to end this. Seems like I think we've got most of, like, I accomplished everything I basically set out to do. I had a lot of fun with this, and I kind of like this reading stream thing. I could be convinced to keep trying and doing more stuff like this. This is a lot of fun. Well, the Raven does feel like a natural stopping point. I feel like once you've hit the Raven, you need to stop. So this is I guess this is it for tonight. Allow me to perhaps change my visage once more. Oh wait, that's a Fumo. Ah, it's me. And I'm back. That was a lot of fun. I hope that I hope you all had fun. This was it was very special for me. I've like I said at the front end, I love the Cask of Amontillado memes. In fact, actually, if there's one thing to do here, if there is one more thing with which to do, maybe we could, perchance, if you would indulge, would you so kindly indulge me, a strange and hurried stranger, of a Cask of Amontillado meme review? Oh boy, you don't know about the Cask of Amontillado memes? Oh, this is gonna be a treat. Well, give me 1 second to get the window capture set up, and we will get this done. Aha! And so, uponst which I have found the Cask of Amontillado memes. Thank you, Google. And so, let us let's get into the bonus content. I hate having to go to know your meme, but yeah, the Cask of Amontillado. For the love of God, sure. Yes, I said, for the love of God. Oh. The train that refuses to work gets them walled up. When your parents ask for all your Fortunato meant. When Fortunato believes your lie about the cask. For the love of God, for the love of God. You're coming. Oh, my bro, come into my cellar and taste the fine vintage. There's a whole world out here. I'm not pretty and I don't see the point in holding a grudge. Anyway, would you like to come into my cellar and taste the fine vintage? Me in a silly hat, completely wasted. Boy, would I! Yeah, this is English teacher humor. Remember the Cask of Amontillado meme? That was a good meme. We should bring that back. I have some Cask of Amontillado memes you might want to come and check them out in my basement. Oh boy, would I? Mythbusters ended too soon. I feel like the Cask of Amontillado is exactly the myth they would have tended, like figuring out how long it takes the mortar to dry, finding the maximum amount of time before knocking down a recently built brick wall, establishing the best place of on a recently shaped wall to topple it and escape, and then doing it all while drunk. Actually, we made this episode, and I have a copy of it in my basement. Do you want to see? Ah. Fortunato in my yeah. The Cask of Amontillado is an incredible meme format. Well, here we're down in the catacombs for the Amontillado. For the Amontillado, right? Go get the Amontillado, he said. It will be fun, he said. Ah. Alright, 5 finely aged Cask of Amontillado memes. When you realize that Monty's show lied about the Amontillado. This guy just built a wall around me. I don't know, just like, I just wanted some free wine and now I'm like, in a wall? 20 minutes into the Cask of Amontillado and chill, and he gives you this look. Ah. Well, I'm glad that I've managed to basically accomplish everything I've wanted out of VTubing as of this stream. I've managed to convince people that Uma Musume Season 2 is very good, which is not a lie. I've showed people the wonder of a Cask of Amontillado memes, and there's not much else. I mean, what else could a doe possibly want out of this world? Thank you all for helping my dreams come true. Well, I am gonna go and take a little break here. I will be back on, my hope is to be back on Saturday for a little bit of a stream. I'm probably gonna play some Fire Emblem 3 Houses, and then on Sunday I'm going to be doing the social psychology chapter of Teach Us Dr. Hirsch, which is the actual, factual, real life title on my degree. That's my actual expertise. So that's one that I'm very knowledgeable about, and I'm sure will be a lot of fun to go over. So with that, I think it's time to maybe give it a little bit of a break and adjourn for the night. Thank you all for joining me on this very special and fairly goofy Cask of Amontillado reading. I would like to do maybe some more reading streams in the future. That could be fun. So we'll see what happens. I'm glad that I'm deciding to put myself out and try some new things because this is a lot of fun. All right. Let's see. Who should I send you to? I'm gonna send you all to Gagaru. I think that she's building an arcade stick. That should be fun. All right. Well, everyone, thank you all again. This is a lot of fun. And yeah, maybe I won't read Gothic horror. I know, Brent. I think you mentioned I favor the villainous, or I'm in love with the villainous might be fun. My maybe I'll do a reading of the third Psyche Sayaka novel, where basically the Yagakimi or Bloom Into You after story. If I can figure out a way to read that without punching my desk over in gay delight, so it'll be fun. All right, I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Take care. Maybe I'll see you on Saturday. It's spooky out here.